leave a like and subscribe.
According to the board by the gate, the place is simply Long Grove Hospital, a peaceful spot within the Surrey countryside. By the main entrance is a marmalade pot lodge, lace curtains at the windows. Forsythia flanks the drive, no one is about. Epsom lies a mile and a half away across the fields, and from there you can see what sort of hospital Long Grove is. All the discretion and forsythia in the world will never alter the outline of the old lunatic asylums built to an identical pattern around London at the turn of the century. All have the same red, Aldershot-style wards and office blocks, the same high water tower that peers like an enormous head across the country, and Long Grove still receives most of its patients from the same part of London as when the London County Council erected it in 1907 to cope with the growing number of the mentally disordered from the slums of Hackney and Bethnal Green. Ronnie was driven here from Winchester Prison on the 20th of February 1958. He was never to forget the terror of those first few days. He was placed in Napier Ward, a locked ward. Trained nurses kept each patient under day and night supervision. I wouldn't move, but sat all day huddled around the radiator. I wasn't quite sure who I was. The radiator seemed the only friend I had because it was warm. I was completely on my own, and funny things used to come and go in my mind. I thought the man opposite me was a dog, and if I got his name right he'd come and jump in my lap. I'd have a friend then, but I never got his name. I didn't recognize anyone, although Reggie and my mother visited me. Sometimes I thought I'd kill myself to stop someone else doing it first. According to his medical report, he had put his hand through a glass window and showed signs of verbijuration and marked thought blocking. He was unstable and in fear of bodily change. He believed people were still plotting against him, tampering with his letters and censoring them for sinister purposes. No intelligence test was carried out, and there was nothing on his report about his criminal case history, but the doctor had wide experience of the mentally sick and seems to have had no difficulty summing up the patient's character: a simple man of low intelligence, poorly in touch with the outside world. For the Long Grove doctors, this was all he was, a simple man, a fairly simple case of schizophrenic breakdown. He would never be entirely cured but could be helped over the breakdown and then stabilized on regular doses of the new tranquilizers that were revolutionizing the treatment of the mentally sick. At Long Grove, they were performing these miracles every day, and the doctors set to work on Ronnie, placing him on Stematol, a drug which dampens down neurotic symptoms without doping the patient completely. Out of the 1,800 patients at the time, 6 were from prisons, and the hospital made a point of insisting to the Home Office that they would be treated exactly like ordinary patients. So Ronnie Kray became a routine case, nothing to make a fuss about. His family agreed, although for slightly different reasons. They knew their Ronnie, he was simply acting up a bit to kid the authorities into giving him a change of scene. Reggie had seen him acting balmy once already in the army and knew the lengths he'd go. If the medical officer at Winchester Jail had been taken in and sent him to this comfortable little hospital near London that just showed what a good actor Ronnie was. Within a week the treatment had begun to take effect. Ronnie had left his radiator and there was no longer a dog in the bed opposite. He began to read again, to recognize his family. The doctors were so pleased with his progress that by the end of March they had him moved from Napier Ward to the M1 block. The doors were left unlocked there. Although schizophrenics form by far the largest single group in Britain's mental hospitals, the disease remains something of a mystery. Kraepelin described it in the 1890s under the name dementia praecox, but medical research is still scratching at its origins and true nature. It can take many forms, although the disease usually develops over a long period and is sparked off by a final crisis. There is no known cure as such, but sufferers can be helped over the florid state of a schizophrenic breakdown by various modern drugs. After effects vary enormously. In Ronnie's case, the medical reports show considerable vagueness over the form of his disease. He was in Long Grove to be treated, and here he was responding rather more quickly than most. But had the Long Grove doctors taken the trouble to find out a little of his history of violence and delusion, it is hard to believe that they would have moved him quite so promptly out of Napier Ward. The hospital's policy of treating mentally sick criminals like ordinary patients was a worthy one as far as it went, but it was patently absurd if it led doctors to ignore the fact that a man like Ronnie was a criminal. For Ronnie was no ordinary schizophrenic whose problems could be tidied up with 3 capsules of Stematol a day. Crime was in part a symptom of his disease, and had his doctors had the time to study his history, they could not have failed to recognize him for what he really was and treated him accordingly. Among the different types of schizophrenics, there is a small group who are potentially dangerous and the most difficult to spot: the paranoid schizophrenics. Most schizophrenics find it hard to face the world and finally collapse through inability to reconcile their delusions within the world outside. The paranoid schizophrenic is different. Even if he has a breakdown, his obsessions can persist despite it. He has the strange power to direct all his mental faculties to the protection of his distorted world. This means that outwardly he can often appear completely logical and normal. Inwardly he is ruled by his obsession as he continues in his vicious circle of ill-advised aggressiveness, self-protection, misinterpretation, spread of delusional ideas, and increasing watchfulness. There are certain symptoms that usually reveal themselves: lack of feeling for others, difficulty in communicating, erratic behavior, extreme moodiness. Often delusions of grandeur are combined with extreme feelings of persecution. Sometimes the paranoid schizophrenic suffers what is called double orientation. He follows the normal world, yet simultaneously identifies with Christ, Napoleon, or some great figure of the past. Frequently he believes himself to be directed by a fate or personality somewhere beyond him. At the same time, the blunting of the emotions sometimes leads to callous and apparently motiveless crimes of violence if his obsession demands it for its defense. Sometimes such violence would seem the only way he could survive. A trifling affair may arouse wild fury, and an incident pregnant with pathos be treated with levity. Qualities like these appear in many of history's great religious leaders, also in its most notorious criminals. Jack the Ripper, Al Capone, and the Boston Strangler are textbook cases of the violent paranoid schizophrenic. So, as the Long Grove doctors might have found out, was Ronnie Kray. But he was recovering so fast that no one did. Stematol was working. Ronnie appeared quite normal, reading, joking, writing letters home. The doctors thought that they had done their job. By the beginning of May, Ronnie appeared so well that he applied to be discharged from hospital and allowed to go back to prison. This request was not as strange as it may seem. Ronnie was haunted by the fate of his Wandsworth friend, Frank Mitchell, who was considered such a public menace that the authorities had refused him a firm release date. Mitchell saw year follow year in prison, never quite knowing when it would all end. Officially certified insane, Ronnie could end up in the same position. The hospital considered his request. At the end of May, 2 doctors examined him. They were both optimistic about his general condition. He showed no marked psychotic symptoms, answered intelligently, and was, they wrote, quiet, cooperative, and mentally subnormal. But he still showed signs of depression. A swift return to prison could bring on a recurrence of his trouble. Reggie was told that for his brother's own good he should stay where he was for a while longer. Ronnie was upset at the news. He thought he would never be released. Reggie calmed him down. He wouldn't let that happen. He had a good idea that ought to work. It had in the past. At Long Grove, the main visiting hours are on Sunday afternoon. East Enders take their families seriously. By 3 o'clock the wards are crammed with Cockney relatives and friends. This is the high spot of the patient's week. The hospital provides tea and biscuits to make everyone feel at home. Not that the Krays and all their friends ever let Ronnie feel neglected. Each Sunday he always had the 2 visitors he was allowed, but during one visiting time after Ronnie's application had been rejected, an extra lot turned up, 2 large American car loads of them. The first car, an electric blue Lincoln, contained Reggie and an old friend of the family called Georgie Osborne. The second, a black Ford, held several characters from the Double R. One was a safe blower, 2 were Xboxers, and the man at the wheel was known for his skill as a smash-and-grab raid driver. Both cars parked just outside Ronnie's block. The men in the Ford told the hospital porter that they hadn't realized visitors were restricted to 2 at a time. They would wait and see Ronnie later. Reggie slipped on a light fawn raincoat and he and Osborne walked into Ronnie's ward. On visiting afternoons there was always a male nurse on duty. On that afternoon there was nothing about Ronnie to give the nurse any particular concern. Ronnie was quite smartly dressed in a blue suit and maroon-colored tie. If he was still upset at the doctor's decision, he was keeping it to himself. His brother in the fawn coat had brought a pile of holiday snaps, and they were all enjoying them. The nurse had never seen Ronnie laugh so much. At 3:30, tea was brewed up in the scullery along the corridor. Regulations forbade patients to pass beyond the ward doors during visiting hours, so one of the visitors usually fetched it. That Sunday the Kray brother in the fawn coat went. The nurse nodded to him as he passed. 20 minutes must have elapsed before the nurse saw anything was wrong. Young Kray was still there, laughing with his visitor, who seemed to have an endless store of snapshots. Why hadn't his brother come back with the tea? Where's your brother? Which brother? Your brother Reggie, who went out to get the tea. Reggie didn't go. Of course he did. I saw him myself. He didn't. I'm Reg Kray. I'll prove it if you don't believe me. Here's my driving license. Then that was Ronnie went out for the tea. Who do you think it was? Thought you knew him by now. The nurse sounded the alarm bell, but it was too late. The black Ford was on its way to London with Ronnie inside. Reggie had previously arranged with him to wear the same blue suit and tie and switched the raincoat with him when the nurse wasn't looking. The police arrived and questioned Reggie and Osborne for over an hour, but there was nothing they could do once Reggie had proved his identity. As he said to one of the police, "It's not as if we actually done anything. We've just been sitting here waiting for a cup of tea that never came." The track lay to the left of the road, a good half-mile before the farm. There was an ancient wooden gate post and the track went trailing up between the fields and the nettle beds towards the woods. Suffolk is a mysterious county, and this was a particularly hidden part of it. Borley Rectory, the most haunted house in England, was 4 miles distant. Even in high summer this countryside, with its decaying manor houses and lanes that lose themselves between the banks of hawthorn and cowparsley, seems to be keeping out intruders. A fortnight before Ronnie's escape, Reggie had driven here towing a 4-berth caravan. The owner of the farm was an old acquaintance, a London businessman the twins had often worked with in the past. He could hardly have refused them a small favor, and at dusk he helped Reggie to maneuver the caravan up the track and into the woods. The escape was widely reported in the press. The police were combing London for this violent criminal. They said, "We know what type of person he is and are taking no chances." But Ronnie had vanished. Reggie continued working at the Double R as usual. Nearly a week after the escape, Reggie closed up his club and drove back to Valence Road. By midnight the downstairs lights were out. Soon the whole house was in darkness. Just after 1 o'clock the back door opened. Reggie slipped out and scrambled over the yard wall. Then along Cheshire Street came the noise of a car starting and driving away. He had a long night's ride ahead. First stop was Walthamstow, where Ronnie was being looked after by friends. He came out muffled in a black overcoat. They arrived at the farm just before dawn. When they had eaten, Reggie took a torch and led his brother out to the caravan. He had to show Ronnie all he had done for him and wanted to be back in Bethnal Green before anyone noticed his absence. The caravan was where he had left it. He unlocked the door, turned on the Cala gas lights and the heater and showed Ronnie how lovingly he had prepared the hideaway, the stacked provisions and the radio, the gramophone with all his favorite records, books, beer, a small gas refrigerator. Under existing prison regulations, any prisoner certified insane who escaped and remained at liberty longer than 6 weeks had to be recertified on recapture. All Ronnie had to do was to behave himself and stay out of the way for a couple of months in the caravan. Then he could give himself up, the certification would have lapsed and he could complete his sentence with a minimum of fuss. Within a year he would be free. Reggie had everything worked out for this. One reason he had chosen this part of Suffolk was so that Ronnie would feel at home. They had both lived nearby as evacuees during the war and had often been back since. But Reggie realized his brother couldn't be left alone all day, and the third man who had traveled down with the twins was to be Ronnie Kray's companion, bodyguard and keeper for the period of his escape. Once again, Reggie had planned things well, for Teddy was one of the few people Ronnie trusted who was also capable of handling him. A young thief, slightly older than the twins, he had grown up in Bethnal Green and had been a trusted follower of the Colonel's in the days of the billiard hall. He was tough, single and heterosexual. Also, unlike most of the Colonel's admirers, he had a certain vein of humor and common sense. Sitting in the Suffolk woods in early June, Teddy had no complaints. Here he was earning £15 a week in luxury and idleness. The caravan was comfortable. There was all the food and beer he wanted, and the Colonel had never been in better spirits. He was a lazy bastard, but he always had been. He'd lie in bed all morning, and Teddy had to cook and keep the caravan tidy. But Ronnie loved the country. It calmed him down, and when he was calm he was like a big child and no trouble at all. They would spar together and run and do exercises to keep fit. Sometimes they took long walks at night, and once they borrowed a car from the farmer up the road and drove to Sudbury to the cinema. Ronnie wanted to see Dracula. For Teddy, being with the Colonel was like being a boy again, and there was one game in particular which Ronnie never tired of, the hunting game. It was Ronnie's idea to use loaded air rifles to make it more realistic, and since he didn't like the thought of hurting animals, he suggested they should stalk each other. Teddy was the better shot and hit Ronnie several times before Ronnie used his cunning and caught his friend in an ambush, hitting him in the eye with a pellet. Teddy had to go to Sudbury Hospital to have it removed. Most weekends Reggie came down to the caravan with a van load of food and drink and a few friends who could be relied on to be discreet. They had some splendid parties. Ronnie would hear all the news from home, and when there were visitors he would usually drink until he dropped off to sleep where he was. Reggie organized these parties to stop Ronnie feeling forgotten, but soon they were having the opposite effect. Talking of London made him realize how much he missed it, and when Reggie and his friends drove back on Sunday night he felt abandoned and confined within the four walls of the caravan. Teddy could get him out of his moods in the end, and they would start their sparring and hunting and midnight walks. Then one more weekend would arrive, another party, and the following week Ronnie's moods would be worse than ever. For the first time now, sex was a problem. Had Ronnie liked women it would have been easier to keep him satisfied, but in the middle of Suffolk it was impossible to ensure the supply of young male prospects he had enjoyed in London without arousing local suspicions. Reggie started bringing boys along at the weekends to keep the Colonel quiet. This was a mistake. Ronnie would always try and make the boy stay. By Sunday afternoons terrible arguments would start when Reggie insisted that the boy return with him. Jealous and frustrated, Ronnie would finally have to watch the boy he fancied driven back to London on a Sunday evening. As usual, Reggie finally gave in. He knew that it was risky, but he let Ronnie have his night in London. It was a success. Reggie had borrowed a flat in Tottenham, and the following day his mother and a few friends visited Ronnie there before he drove back to the country. But if Reggie imagined that the Colonel would be satisfied with one visit, he should have known him better. He was soon clamoring for another. Within a week Reggie had given in again, arranging a small party for the Colonel at a fresh address. The following week there was another, and in no time the comings and goings were being whispered around the East End. The Colonel's legend had begun again. One evening Ronnie would turn up at Valence Road. Another, he materialized in the middle of the engagement party for his cousin Rita, who was marrying his old friend Richie Smith. He even visited the Double R. This was the Colonel's own command performance, and the twins made the most of it. It was arranged for late at night, long after closing time, when the place had been cleared of all but the most trusted of their friends. As a special precaution, a decoy car, similar to Ronnie's, was driven to the club first, and someone of Ronnie's height and build hurried in with his collar up and face muffled. Everyone waited in case the law had been watching. When nothing happened, Reggie had his moment of drama, lifting the telephone, dialing the number where Ronnie was waiting, allowing it to ring twice, and then replacing it. This was the signal that the coast was clear. 10 minutes later the Colonel arrived. Soon they were famous, these fly-by-night visits of the Colonel to the Double R, a great and secret for the other world of London criminals, and Reggie was quick to draw maximum kudos from his now notorious brother. Many of the top London villains were invited to the Double R after closing time to witness the Colonel's famous reappearing act. One night Billy Hill was there. Since he had retired from his kingship of the underworld, Billy Hill had changed. Wealth and exile had softened him, and he was a reserved, softly spoken figure now, blinking from behind large magnifying spectacles and giving the impression of a certain shyness often adopted by those who have withdrawn from the power game. But although he had opted out, he had a nose for what was going on and who was rising. For him to turn up at the Double R on one of his occasional visits from abroad showed that the twins were news again. Charlie Kray saw what was happening and did his best to warn Reggie. Ronnie should be thinking of surrendering and getting his sentence over, but by now the twins were far too busy enjoying the situation. One night Ronnie disguised himself and walked the length of the Whitechapel Road, laughing each time he passed the policeman who was still supposed to be searching for him. Another time he put on one of Reggie's suits and sat in a pub where the locals were used to seeing his brother. "Evening, Reg," said someone. "Any news of Ron?" "No, why? I've heard he's about. Have you seen him lately? Wish him luck if you meet him." Then Reggie had an idea. Through his doctor, he found the name of a good Harley Street psychiatrist and made an appointment for a Mr. John Lee. Lee was their mother's maiden name, and on the day of the appointment it was Ronnie Kray who turned up at the Harley Street waiting room. He was well dressed, quite calm, and he and Reggie had carefully worked out beforehand what to say. When he saw the doctor, Ronnie explained his problem. He was engaged to be married. He and the girl were very much in love, but her family had raised an objection. Some way back in his family there had been a touch of insanity, and they were worried that he might go the same way. His girlfriend wasn't worried, but could the doctor give him a test or two and write a letter saying he wasn't mad? It would set his future in-laws' minds at rest. The psychiatrist was a good-natured man with a sense of humor. It was an unusual request but not unreasonable. Mr. Lee seemed a normal, somewhat earnest young man. They talked for 20 minutes or so. The doctor asked various questions which Ronnie answered satisfactorily, and the doctor wrote a brief note on his headed paper giving it as his serious professional opinion that Mr. John Lee of 178 Valence Road was as sane as the next man. The letter from the psychiatrist was one reason why Reggie wouldn't listen to Teddy when he told him that Ronnie was going mad again. During their adventures in London, Reggie was seeing the Colonel he knew, but every time Ronnie returned to the caravan for a few days, Teddy saw something different and was becoming frightened. Each trip to London now left Ronnie deeply depressed, and he spent days in bed, drinking himself into a stupor. If he got up, things were worse. Anything in the outside world could start his fears. One day he saw someone passing down the road and spent the whole day worrying. By evening he was frantic, shouting that he had to get away to London. Teddy called in the farmer. Between them they quietened him down, got him drunk and left him to sleep off his fears. They decided that until they could speak to Reggie, Ronnie and Teddy would both sleep at the farm. It would be easier to control him there if anything went wrong. The rest of that day Ronnie seemed quite happy pottering around the farm. That evening after supper he and the farmer watched television. Suddenly the telephone rang. It was someone from the village reminding the farmer about some business he had forgotten. When he had promised to do it and replaced the telephone, he said, "I wish he'd leave me alone. He's just a bloody menace, that man." Ronnie fell silent. They had a few drinks. Television ended, and as the farmer was going off to bed, Ronnie stopped him. "Listen," he said, "you've been a good friend and I know just how you feel about that bastard getting at you on the phone. Just give me his address. I'll kill him for you. It's the only thing to do with scum like that." The farmer was no fool and knew that Ronnie meant just what he said. That night the farmer rang a Harley Street psychiatrist he knew, explained the situation and arranged to take Ronnie to see him the next day. This time the examination was more probing than on Ronnie's previous visit to Harley Street. They drove back to the farm in time for supper. Ronnie was feeling tired. When he was in bed, the farmer rang the specialist for his verdict. "I don't know who your friend is, but he's clearly homicidal. He shows all the symptoms of advanced paranoid schizophrenia. Get him to hospital or anything could happen." Reggie wouldn't hear of it. Although the farmer rang him straight away, Ronnie was convinced that once he entered any institution his enemies would get him and he would be there for life, and he could still present quite a coherent front to the world in general. Teddy and the farmer were the only friends who really knew how sick he was, and so the trips to London continued. When the farmer suggested getting Ronnie medical treatment, storms of resentment followed. Then for the farmer and for Teddy the problem solved itself. The year 1958 was a vintage one for jailbreaks. Ronnie's departure from Long Grove was eclipsed by that virtuoso fugitive, Mr. Alfred Hines, who earlier that year had walked out of the law courts in the Strand and never been heard of since. Hines was a bigger fish than Ronnie Kray. The police were still searching for him, and nearly picked up Ronnie Kray instead. Somebody had seen his midnight walks from the farm and reported them to the police. There was a slender chance that this was Hines. Early one morning the Sudbury police called at the farm to check in case it was. Ronnie and Teddy by now slept permanently at the farm. Both were in bed, but the farmer handled the police perfectly, asking them in, explaining that his guest did like walking at night, then calling Teddy to meet them. This settled things at once. No one could possibly mistake this burly young tough for the gnome-like Mr. Hines. The police departed, but Ronnie had been listening upstairs. He had been dreading the police for weeks. His fears now seemed confirmed. No one could reason with him. Either he got away at once or he would kill anyone who tried to stop him. The farmer agreed with him, rang through to Reggie at the RR, and left it to Ronnie to beg his brother to come and take him away. This time Reggie was convinced. By the time he came, Ronnie was worse. "You are not my brother. You're just a dirty Russian spy got up to look like him." "Of course I'm Reg, you've known me all your life." "No, you just look like him. You're a dirty agent in disguise. Your police missed me this morning. You've come to take me off to kill me somewhere." "Listen, Ron. Don't you remember the old scar on my arm?" Ronnie did remember, and allowed himself to be led out to his brother's car and driven up to London. He insisted on making the whole journey in the boot. For Reggie Kray, the fantasy was over. He had to face the truth about his brother. The game they'd played was finished. Ronnie was no colonel, but his mentally deranged twin brother. Now for the first time he was truly scared. "For a while," said Reg, "I really thought that I was going off my head myself. There was one person who might help, their mother." Once they were back at Valence Road, Violet Kray managed to calm Ronnie for a while, but not for long. How did he know that this was Valence Road? It looked like it, but that proved nothing. Similarly with this woman, she looked just like his mother, but possibly that went to prove just what a cunning lot they were. "You're all a lot of dirty filthy murderers," he sobbed.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please join our Facebook group. It's called Krays Crime Lords of London. We're a friendly moderated group with over 1,000 Kray and other celebrated gangster videos available for view. There's also thousands of images in the photos sections. The link for the group is in the YouTube description section. I hope we see you there soon.
Leave a like and subscribe.